Okay, I'd like to make a little video for you just to get you started. We're going to be using this semester. We're going to be using Paige Kelly's Biblical Hebrew and Introductory Grammar, second edition, and this is what it's going to look like. Second edition by Paige Kelly and revised by Timothy Crawford. So when you're buying your book, do make sure it is the second edition. So what I'd like to do, though, is just present a separate little video on the alphabet, and this will allow you to get started. This is going to correspond to lesson number 1 in Paige Kelly, the alphabet. And so we will go over Unit 1 in the first lesson, but I want to just discuss a few things with you and get you started on memorization of this alphabet. So in Hebrew, they will refer to this as the Aleph Beit because they name it after the Aleph, which is the first letter, and the second letter is Beit, Aleph Beit. It's the alphabet. Okay. Now, we're looking at 23 consonants, and I have put these in the order of left to right. It doesn't really matter how you put the alphabet. Just do keep in mind that we're going to be reading from right to left. But starting over on the left-hand side, we have Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. Okay, now there are a couple of things that we should note from the way that I've laid this out. First of all, we have 5 groups, 4 groups of 5, and then a group of 3. This is how I would recommend you memorizing the alphabet. Break it into chunks. This is why we have, for example, in phone numbers, we don't memorize really long. We break them into parts, right? So we break the phone numbers into parts so that we can memorize a chunk, and then a chunk, and then a chunk, and then put it together. So this is what I would recommend with your memorization. Note the final letters here. So the first 2 columns don't have any final letters in them, but the next 2, so we have a kaf, and this one occurs anywhere in the word except for the end of the word. This is the final form. So put an F here. This is the final form. You only see this form at the end of a word. The Lamed does not have a final form. It has only one form, but the Mem has a final form. Only at the end of a word will you see this form. And the Nun also has a final form. The Pei has a final form, the next column. Tzadeh has a final form. And that should be it. Okay. So do note that this is very important because you basically you're memorizing only one letter, but you're memorizing 2 forms at the same time. Okay, so note the final letters. That's the main thing here. But when you memorize these, I would recommend doing it something like this: Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. So break them into smaller chunks and then memorize them separately, then put them together. That's the best way to do it, I think. Okay, now among these consonants that we have just looked at, we have what are called, it's a type of letter called a guttural. Okay, so there are technically only 4 gutturals: the Aleph, the Ayin, the He, and the Chet. There is a 5th letter that is not technically a guttural, but you might as well memorize it as a guttural. It's the Resh. Resh, it often behaves like a guttural, and we'll talk about how they all behave. Historically, they're pronounced in the back of the throat. Even the resh, not for us, we typically say rah, rah. But historically, it was also pronounced back in the back. Very difficult sound for us to make, but that's how it was done. This results in interesting changes in the surrounding vowels. In other words, if you have an aleph, or let's say particularly these two, the ayin and the chet, if you have a word like this, so we have that we would expect this form, and we'll get into this a little bit, but this is what we would expect. But because of that ayin and because of the resh, we get a change from the I vowels to A vowels. It becomes sha'ar. They ultimately will change the vowels around them. They're very picky about their friends. That's the way to think about it. They don't like to be in the presence of certain vowels, and so they will alter the vowels surrounding them sometimes. So that's something we'll have to keep in mind. Nothing to panic about. It's something that I'll bring up as we go along. They prefer to be preceded and sometimes followed by A-class vowels. That's the main thing to remember. And then lastly, they reject the dagesh. We're going to talk about this. There is a way to double the letter without writing two of them, and that you put a dot in the middle of them. And these will not allow that. They will not be doubled. Okay, they will not be doubled. Okay. Now, just a note on guttural pronunciation. So if you have an aleph or an ayin at the beginning and the end of the word, okay, so here we have an aleph at the beginning of the word. You don't pronounce it at all. All we are pronouncing when we pronounce this letter, when we pronounce this word, is we're pronouncing this vowel at the beginning. Ah, share. Asher. Okay, so at the beginning, these gutturals are silent, and at the end, so here we have a hey, v'haita. It's silent. The aleph, same way, hanimsa, hanimsa. Okay. You'll note this little. This is actually an accent mark that I'll use in the production of any extra videos that I put together, and this just means this is where you accent this word. Share, amecha, v'haita, uvaet, hanimsa. That's where you put the accent. That's all that means. Kelly's going to use a slightly different one, but his is consistent as well. The ayin and the aleph are glottal stops in the middle of the word. Okay, so if we look at a word like uh-oh in English, this little symbol is representing what the sound of the aleph or the ayin is like in the middle of a word. So look at this one. We have u, va, et. It's like a stopping of the air in the middle of the word. Uva et. Uva et. You can't hardly even hear it. It's as though it's silent, but it's the stopping of the air in the back of the throat. Okay, we'll look more and more at pronunciation. I don't expect you at this point to be pronouncing these. We haven't looked at the vowels. Do note that the chet is pronounced like so if we have a word like brother, this is the word for brother. We have at the end of this word we have a chet. It would be pronounced ach, ach, ach. The hey is pronounced like an H when it's not at the end of the word. And then a resh is historically pronounced at the back and the top of the mouth like but it's easier just to pronounce it like an R and not worry about it. Okay, so it's no problem. I am not a big stickler about how you pronounce it because, in fact, a lot of people pronounce it differently, even among modern Hebrew speakers. So it's not that big of a deal. Okay, now I'm going to leave this up for just a minute, and I want to just note that in this slide you can find in both of these verses, Ecclesiastes 4:8 and Zechariah 6:11, you can find every letter of the alphabet. Now, it doesn't mean you'll have all of the final forms. You don't have a final kaf, and you don't have a final pay in either one of these. So just note that. But you can find. So this is what I would recommend you doing. So while I'm talking about it, you can just pause this video. But while I'm talking about it, you could be looking through, and you could say, okay, let's find an aleph. And then every time you come to an aleph, you say aleph, circle it, aleph, aleph, aleph. You'll know there are tons of these, right? So aleph is everywhere. So you won't want to. You might want to do them all. It's fine if you do. The bait. Find the baits. I may be overlooking some. There's one. Some of them will have a dot in them. It's okay. Just ignore the dots for right now. We'll look at those. There's another bait. Every time you come to it, say bait, bait. You want to be able to name these as well. Bait. Okay. Now let's look for a gimel. Gimel. There's a gimel. Okay. So we need to get very good at recognizing these letters and then ultimately pronouncing them. So not that many gimels, not that many at all. Let's look in the next one. Here we go. We do have a gimel here. Both of these verses should have all of the letters in one form or another. So then we have dalet. Here's a dalet, and be careful with this one because it looks very similar to the resh. So this is the dalet up top. Look at the resh down here. That's very similar. The dalet has that little tick on the side of upper right hand side. Okay, so dalet, aleph, beit, gimel, dalet, and then hey. We want to find the hey. Here's a hey. They're often going to be at the ends of words. Here's one at the beginning. Hevel, hevel. Okay, so there's a hey. And then a vav. Vav's going to be very common. Vav. And then let's look for a Zion. Zion. I saw one earlier. Here's one in the second verse. Zahav. Vazahav. There's a Zion. Here's a Zion. Top one. Zeh. Okay. Now I'm not going to do all these for you, but just take your time, work through these. If you need to have a print off, send me an email. I'll send you a print off of these in PDF, or just I'll send you a whole chapter of Hebrew. That's fine. And then you can just go through and name them. This is a very important step in the learning process. You can practice writing them as well. Whatever you'd like to do, but for sure, be able to recognize them and then also be able to name them, say what they are. So it's important to have the language to talk about them as well. Not just be able to recognize them and pronounce them, but also to say what kind of letter they are. Okay, so that's really all there is to do. But I wanted to get that out there for you before we begin the class. That way you can be working on memorization of the alphabet.